Hello, my name is Pshenitzni and I am a master's student at the Technion, Israel Institute of Technology. Dina ציבולסקי is my supervisor and head of our Biology Education Research Group. In this presentation, we will present you our study that deals with the conceptions of museum educators on integration of nature of science aspects. First of all, let's start with the definition of nature of science. Nature of science is a concept that addresses the way science is defined, the way it operates, the reciprocal relationship between science and society, and the identity of scientists in terms of their professional and personal lives. Nature of science can be viewed as a concept that relates to the various characteristics of science, including epistemic cognitive aspects and institutional social aspects. Epistemic cognitive aspects relate to what is a scientific theory, what is a scientific model, which evidences are acceptable in science. Institutional social aspects relate to how does society influence science, what is a scientific consensus, and what is the role of peer review. Educational research on nature of science has indicated that understanding nature of science facilitates and improves students' learning of scientific content, arouses interest, and encourages critical thinking. Also providing tools for dealing with and correctly assessing scientific information. A lot of research on nature of science has been done in the context of formal education. But in the context of informal education, a little research has been done to date. That's why we chose to focus on our research on natural history museums, which are informal learning environments that present the history of nature and scientific research. These museums shape the public opinion about science as an activity and scientists as a community. Also, as research institutions and institutions that appeal to the general public are at the forefront of access to science knowledge and narratives, which help to the learning of science. At those museums, we wanted to focus on museums educators, which act as mediators between the museum visitors and the exhibits, designing the exhibit's content, display and determining how that content should be presented. To date, there have been no studies about natural history museum educators' conceptions of nature of science and the way they address, if at all, nature of science aspects while guiding museum visitors through the exhibits. To address this gap, we chose to conduct a phenomenographic study with the goal of examining the conceptions of natural history museum educators regarding the integration of nature of science aspects in their work with the visiting public. The focus of our study was on museum educators working in 4 natural history museums in Israel, which located in various regions, and had agreed to participate in the study. The research participants were 15 museum educators, 10 women and 5 men, who differed in their degree of education and the extent of their experience as museum educators. As I mentioned before, the research approach we chose was phenomenography, which investigates the qualitatively different ways in which people think about various phenomena. In this study, we wanted to find the variation in conceptions of museum educators about integration of nature of science aspects during their guidance. We wanted to uncover all of their conceptions, which were mentioned in the interview, and to state them in our research. Data was gathered by conducting individual semi-constructed interviews that were recorded and transcribed. Each participant was interviewed once for approximately 45 minutes using Zoom. Examples of questions asked in the interviews. How do you reference the characteristics of science and scientific research during your guidance? What are the topics of the guidance at the museum? What are the main points in the guidance and how do you relate to them? In your guidance, how do you reference the reciprocal relationship between science and society? After the transcription step, we identified utterances, which are connected with the research question. These quotes became the data pool. Later, we made a differentiation within the pool of meanings we got. Then, on the basis of similarities, the quotes brought together into categories. Later, those categories were differentiated into dimensions, on the basis of the differences between them. Our data analysis revealed three major dimensions in museum educators' conceptions regarding the integration of nature of science aspects in their work, and several differences were identified in each dimension. Here we can see the major dimensions, referring to scientific research in general, referring to scientific research conducted at the museum, and referring around museum exhibits. Next, we will discuss the different categories in each dimension, which regard to the differences in the conceptions. Here is the point to mention that our study is still in process, so in the future we may show additional findings. First dimension we found is referring to scientific research in general as a conception of museum educators about integration of nature of science aspects in their guidance. We found 5 categories which show the differences in their conceptions, as you can see here. During conversation with the visitors, by telling stories about history of science, by telling stories about research projects, practical experience at the museum, and by reference to a scientific way of thinking. As an example, I would like to show you one quote of utterance of one museum educator in the reference to integration nature of science aspects by telling stories about research projects. I think that a museum educator has a part in making science accessible, something that always gets into conversation, and I always try to put it where I can and where it is relevant, because I think that it's very important that people won't only see the final message, not just tell them the streams in Israel are polluted, but that they will understand what research is done and how it is done, and that there are people here who are really working on it. We can see that the nature of science aspect which reflected here is science as a human endeavor. Second dimension of museum educators' conceptions that we found was referring scientific research conducted at the museum. We found 2 categories which show the differences in their conceptions, as you can see here, by reference to museum as a research institution, and during conversation with the visitors. Here we can see reference to integration nature of science aspects by referring to the museum as a research institution. I do like to tell about research that is going on, because some of it is very interesting. Many of the studies were conducted here at the university, so it somehow adds to the museum's reputation, saying that the research was actually conducted here by researchers who work at the museum, and it was here that something was researched. The nature of science aspect which reflected here are science as a way of knowing and the work of scientists. Third dimension of museum educators' conception that we found was referring around museum exhibits. We found 7 categories which show the differences in their conceptions, as you can see here. By posting questions, during conversation with the visitors, by talking about current issues, by telling stories about research projects, by telling stories about research projects at the museum, by telling stories about history of science, and by scientific demonstrations. Here we see reference to integration nature of science aspects by posting questions. You start by raising some questions and then ask, how can that be tested and proven? The truth is, I don't do this a lot. You have to find the right moment for that. It isn't appropriate for every exhibit in the museum or for every group of visitors. Nature of science aspects, which reflected here, are science is a way of knowing, and scientific knowledge is based on empirical evidence. As discussed before, here you can see again the three major dimensions in conceptions of museum educators about integration of nature of science aspects during their guidance. These dimensions include categories which show differences in the conceptions of museum educators, which we stated in our research. Let's move on to the conclusions of our research. We can mention the following. Most of the museum educators have awareness to the importance of nature of science integration in their guidance. They do not reflect the term nature of science, but in their interview to talk about it in different ways as a part of speaking about science. Also, there are different conceptions of museum educators about the integration of nature of science aspects during their guidance. The contribution of our study is by enriching the existing knowledge regarding natural history museum educators' conceptions of nature of science aspects while guiding the exhibits. Our research opens new opportunities for future research, such as research the conceptions of museum educators in other geographical and cultural contexts. Our future studies will focus on research of nature of science aspects mediation in the guidance, in order to check the interactions during it, and it is going to be my PhD work. ועכשיו לכמה מילים בעברית. קודם כל, אני רוצה להודות למנחה שלי, דוקטור דינה ציבולסקי, על ההכוונה המקצועית, על העזרה ועל העצות הטובות, וכמובן על כך שתמכת בי לאורך כל הדרך והיית לי לאוזן קשבת. תודה רבה לגברת שקמה כלפון על העזרה המקצועית בתחום האדמיניסטרטיבי. בלעדייך הכל היה מסובך הרבה יותר. תודה רבה למשפחתי היקרה, להוריי המדהימים שתמיד שם לאורך כל הדרך, לחמי וחמתי וכמובן לבעלי והילדים, שבלי האהבה והתמיכה והנחת לא הייתי מגיעה עד כאן. תודה רבה לחברות הצוות היקרות שלי, שתמיד שם אחת בשביל השנייה, וכמובן גם בשבילי. שנמשיך כך לאורך כל הדרך, לעוד שנים ארוכות, במחקר פורה ומעניין לצד דוקטור דינה ציבולסקי. תודה רבה לכל מי שעזר בהכנת הרצאה הזו, וכמובן לכל מי שהקשיב והגיב. לשאלות אתם מוזמנים לפנות אליי בדואר האלקטרוני. אתם מוזמנים גם להיכנס לאתר קבוצת המחקר שלנו ולצפות בעבודות מחקר נוספות.